So welcome back, everybody, to another webinar organized by Princeton University's Bendheim Center for Finance. We're very happy to have Eric Schmidt with us. Hi, Eric.
Yes, hi. I'm really glad to be here.
Glad to have you. And I know, but you don't need an introduction. Everybody knows Eric. He's a former chairman of Google and now works for Schmidt Futures, his own philanthropy organization. Today, we will talk a lot about technology and society, privacy, about free thinking, algorithms and AI, cybersecurity, and other issues. And we follow a different format today. We have more a chat back and forth. I will ask some questions and Eric will give me his perspective on that. At the end, we will have some Q&A sessions, and you can also submit your questions during Eric's presentation. And I will collect them and interject them immediately or at the end, depending how it fits better. So let me start with technology and society, where technology has probably the biggest revolution or the biggest changes we see in societies are going on right now due to technology. Of course, we have the COVID crisis as well, and COVID will interact with technology, and we will come back to that. But one thing you think about, if you think about the Arab Springs or the Malaysian elections, initially the technology in the 2000s was very much supporting grassroots democracy and giving more power to the people, while now it seems like technology is helping the centralized powers a lot and can support authoritarian governments and secret services and so forth. And the question is, I would like to understand, how do you interpret the shift? Do you agree with the shift that it as a technology was enabling much more democracy looking at the Arab Spring and which was shifting, or do you think that's a misrepresentation? And if it's such a shift, how do you explain that? Why is this the case? Do you have any take on that, Eric?
Well, thank you, Markus, and I'm really happy to be here. I think as many listeners know, I'm a proud member of Princeton class of 1976. When I was an undergraduate at Princeton, there was no computer science department. I was, in fact, an electrical engineer, although I in practice did computer science. 45 years later, computer science is the #1 major at Princeton, beating economics, historically the best and most important major, which you're a part of that department. So I'm very excited about that. And it's true throughout the United States and in many other countries that computer science has become the #1 major. So when you think about it, just in terms of number of people and so forth, and the top people really are drawn to the field now, that has a lot of implications for future society, the way things will work, and so forth. As to your question, I think there was a common narrative sort of started by my generation of computer scientists that technology was freeing and that the distributed nature of technology, the personal computer fought against the man in the form of the corporation, the internet forced against the traditional media companies, that was the argument. And that somehow this was going to lead to a very large number of decentralized experiments. Well, that did occur with the arguments that you're saying. But at the same time, governments have also learned how to use this technology. They've been slower. And now you have a situation where some countries are able to put enormous surveillance structures on their citizens. Obviously, we're not in favor of that. But the fact that it's possible, in my view, means it's likely to occur somewhere in the world. Sort of a simple rule of the internet is if stuff is possible, it's likely to occur. There's just too many ways in which it can be used, in my view, misused, etc. And I think the internet is the biggest story of my life, and I think that's going to continue for a long time.
And do you see new technologies coming up which make it more distributive, that you can distribute the powers more? Is some blockchain or some other cryptographic technologies which you think would help to push the balance a little bit, or do you think that's unlikely to occur?
I'm worried about a number of things. I think it is possible using technology to put people in a digital prison, a surveillance prison. This may be a plan, or this may be a side effect of other things. But we at least in the West, have had the ability to move and to associate and to do things without sort of surveillance, if you will. Mm. And the logic of surveillance is that bad things happen. And so if you have enough surveillance, these bad things will be caught. But what is not understood is that with surveillance also comes a moderating of activity. People, if they know they're being watched, will behave somewhat differently. The technology for face recognition in the last decade has gotten extremely good. And I was recently in China before COVID, and there's no question that they are the global leader in technology that's based on vision, using very sophisticated algorithms. They can match to your gait and to where you are, and they can figure out which car you're in, and these sorts of things. And I think that's an unwelcome development in technology.
So what are your arguments that we want to have a libertarian order, essentially, or preserve the libertarian order? One could argue for the COVID crisis, you want to deviate from it temporarily because you need more coordination. There are a lot of externalities if somebody is not behaving, with social distancing accordingly. So it creates externalities for the rest of society. But how do you ensure that there will be a temporary deviation? It's not a permanent shift away from, more individual decision-making towards a centralized decision-making.
So one of the problems in human society is that when temporary enactment, things are putting in, they develop constituencies that then prevent them from being reversed to where they were before. When I was a boy, we had the fuel crisis. And so they put in the 55-mile-an-hour speed limit. And when there was plenty of fuel, they kept the speed limit for 15 or so more years under various arguments about safety and death rates and so forth, which turned out not to hold up. And it took 15 years after a real crisis, the gas crisis, to get rid of what should have been temporary rules. I'll give you another example. In New York, Madison Avenue is in great trouble because of the high-end stores and lack of purchases. A lot of those purchases are Europeans who come to New York because they like New York and they buy things. Now, does America allow Europeans to easily come to the United States today? And the answer is no. And that's presumably under the argument that the United States is relatively safe in COVID and Europe is very dangerous with COVID, which might have been true in the first week of March, but is certainly not true today. And yet the rule is still in place. Why does this rule still exist? And I think thinking of it from the standpoint of economics and global trade and so forth, this is an impediment to progress. Last week, I flew myself across the country, right, in the United States, because you can't leave the country, in my helicopter. And I was wondering about the United States and the middle part of it. And the middle part of the United States is now this very large set of stores and distribution hubs and highways and so forth for goods which don't have endpoints because we don't allow foreigners into our country. And no one is talking about this. So I think if you go back to basic economics, something that you know much better than I, we benefited from globalization and global trade, and we are systematically getting rid of it for reasons that don't make any sense to me.
So we should have, for all the COVID measures, essentially some automatic expiry date, or at least to make sure that...
Well, or a test based on some metric. But yes. What the government does is it writes rules. The government is a monopoly, and it gets to write monopoly rules. And those monopoly rules, if they're not conditioned by some reason why they were put in place, you really have to wonder why you're making those rules permanently. I think that I think everyone would agree that the United States response to COVID has been horrendous. And the easiest way to understand this is that this is a pandemic which in its earliest phases was doubling every 3 days. In a pandemic, which is a real conflict, you have to have centralized and coordinated response. You really do, because it's a shared problem for everyone. And because we didn't have that, the rest is history. I don't think that means that you should have authoritarian government. I don't think it means that you should put in a surveillance state. I just mean that there should have been coordination around a common threat. And by the way, there should have been global coordination. This was the first opportunity that humanity had to face a common enemy for all human beings, Chinese, Americans, Africans, whatever. And we did not, in fact, cooperate in our response. We, in fact, became less coordinated. And that does not bode well for our future.
So let's perhaps move to the next topic, which is about privacy. And it's, if you have a private sphere, you feel more comfortable to brainstorm and think freely. Of course, you're much in the public sphere, but whenever you're in a public sphere, you think a lot about your self-image. So the first premise is that, the self-image is very, very important, and you might limit your free brainstorming, free thinking. And we have a shift going where most of the things which were in the private sphere move much more in the public sphere. And in the future, you might be even through face recognition or other measures, you might even figure out the feelings you have, the inner feelings. And you might not be, people might know he's not supporting me and he doesn't say it, but you can figure out from his facial recognition or from other measurements. And in the future, we might also connect each other's brains much more efficiently than just through voice or other ways. But that also means that third parties can measure it. Do you think there's a danger that we move too much into the public sphere and we have no private space where we can talk freely and brainstorm freely and do random thoughts, even without destroying our self-image? And that kills creativity and free thinking, and certain societies are more in danger on this. Like, if you look at the free society, like in the US, it's less in danger than other countries. And in the worst thing, you might think, can we still conspire a revolution or kick out a government? If, is this totally impossible in a world where you can measure everything and everything is in the public sphere?
I think the good news is it's going to be a very long time before technology, science, other people can invade the way each of us thinks inside of our head. But what we do know is that people are very much affected by social media and by various biases. So for example, anchoring bias, where the first thing they hear becomes the fact and then they reason from that fact. Recency bias, where they basically have the most recent fact is the one that they're operating on, et cetera, et cetera. These are well-known human principles. And I think social media and the political world operates on those. I think you have to have a conceptual framework for how you believe about privacy, social media, and publicity. And my conclusion from this is that you should protect your own privacy because it's easy to lose it. It's easy for people to take it away from you. And sometimes that's under the rubric of safety, right? So cameras on streets and things like that. The fact that there is the possibility for ubiquitous camera means a potential loss of privacy and in theory an increase in safety, right, if it's implemented properly. So what I would say is that people are being more careful now about what they say in public. And I see that as a secular change. In other words, we went from sort of fast and loose, whatever, to an understanding that we're all part of an information space and we're adapting to how this new information space works. And when I say information space, what we're doing right now is part of the information space. The news, the radio, all of the social media that everyone consumes, what people are talking about. There is an information space, and it is being affected by modern communications techniques, and it can be affected in ways that are manipulative. So, for example, by foreign governments.
So that you already mentioned something, the freedom to speak or freedom of speech. There's of course a new culture emerging of this cancel culture where you say something and then you will be just sidelined because others will say it much more loudly or push you in a particular corner. And this might also limit the freedom of speech and also the exchange of information and debate and honest debate about that. And so the whole freedom of speech issue is a very, very important issue, and that there's probably not enough debate on this issue, how we should regulate this in the future. But it seems to me, who is deciding on this freedom of speech? Are these more the tech companies, or is it really the government, or do we have a social debate about that? I mean, there is a lot of uneasiness in the society. But do you think the government should rule this, or it should be done by the tech companies, or which authority should do it? And the second question is it more an international issue? Can you actually do it within national boundaries, or is it an international thing? So should it be even some international body deciding about this, or what should be the outcome for that? Do you have any take on that?
We appear to be getting rid of globalization for a while. And so it's probably better to talk on a per country basis. Perhaps the EU will be a group. Mm-hmm. This is, in my view, very bad. So I'm not endorsing it in any way. But let me speak to the domestic issues. I come down in this debate on the absolute importance of freedom of speech, which I define as speech that I don't like. So if you define freedom of speech as speech that is permissible and that is popular or polite or so forth, then I think you don't have the same definition of freedom of speech that I do. And I think our country has done better because of that over the years. I am concerned that mob behavior, rude behavior, and so forth is stifling speech. The ones to worry about it the most for are women, by the way, because women, when they speak out on social media, are often viciously attacked, much worse than the equivalent man, for reasons that I don't fully understand. With respect to the question of the government's role and the company's role, I am assuming that there will be constant pressures to regulate any company that's in the information space, because information is so powerful. And therefore, each of the companies, and I won't talk about specific companies, but I think it's you can reason from each company what they should probably do, is going to have a very sophisticated strategy for how it's going to respond to this, and also to deal with the threat of regulation. In YouTube a few years ago, there were YouTube videos that were clearly, there were problems with them. They were wrong and so forth and so on. They were manipulative. God knows how they got there. And the company at the time made a decision that some YouTube videos were monetizable and some of them were not. And it also made a decision that for a certain category of videos, it wouldn't recommend videos that were like it. Because you had a problem where you'd get some stereotypically a young man who would become radicalized by watching the recommendation engine doing one after the other. I view those as good modifications from a YouTube perspective, because they are balances of interest. The information was still there, but it was a little harder to make money off. It was a little harder to find, but the information was still there. And I think that's probably how we're going to deal with this. It's going to get much worse because of misinformation. And with modern deepfake technology, it's going to be possible to build videos, more importantly than audio, which are extremely manipulative and outcome causing. Sorry for the sentence. And it's going to be difficult to detect deepfakes. It's going to be difficult to regulate them. And so the tech companies as a group have all sorts of projects trying to address this. But if you think about it, let's say you're not, but let's say that there's some evil corporation that's trying to spread some misinformation. It's in its interest to condition its market with this evil information by spreading misinformation. So smoking is good for you, for example, which it's not. Another example is politically, we've already seen foreign governments do the same thing in the American information space and in other countries as well. So I think we should expect that this ability to manipulate facts and get people excited is going to get worse. One of the studies that I was reading about is that things which are alarmist or emotional are spread 8 times more than things that are not. And most people don't even read the articles, they respond to the headlines. So that strikes me as something that can get fixed. You know, you can moderate that, you can slow the storm down without a loss of freedom. And that's an accommodation, but while preserving free speech. Another example is with respect to bullhorns. I have the ability to say what I'm saying, and thank you for listening to me. What would happen if I had 100 people with bullhorns saying the same thing over and over again? Is that free speech, or is that manipulation? And we haven't decided where that line is.
And should we promote a debate in the society on this, concept, or do you see a debate at universities, or is it the task of public policy schools to really figure this out and have an academic debate and a public debate more generally? Or what would you? I know that you're setting up a university. Is this one of the focus of your new setup?
No, I'm doing a number of things in education. The article that you're referring to was a misdescription of what we were doing. Okay. I am the chairman of an AI task force for the Congress, and we collectively and unanimously recommended a civilian university for technical skills for the government, which we're very excited about, and we'll see if the Congress agrees, but we obviously think it's a fantastic idea. My general view on these things is that when you make strategy in a vacuum, and you do it emotionally, you end up with sort of bad governance. So I think that my general view is that universities' job is to debate the deeper impacts of these things and to have a robust debate. And that part of the way our system works is that the people who are participating in those debates eventually come to power. But the learning that they get in a university is profound. So I love the fact that universities are having these debates, and I love the fact that those people will graduate and eventually become president of the United States, and we'll see. Hopefully, they will be stronger in the future as a result.
But aren't the times moving too fast for, until they become presidents of the United States? You graduate, and then it takes another 30, 40 years, and times are changing much faster now than in the
it is
50 years ago.
It is canonical that everyone complains about everything changing all the time.
Okay.
But that was true 20 years ago and 30 years. People think that things are changing too quickly. I would argue they're changing too slowly. Okay. Right? That in fact, that the technology base that's being built here is so profoundly powerful in terms of how it can improve human society in medicine, in distance learning, in AI in general, in making people smarter, that we should be advancing it. I understand the fear, and the fear is particularly because you don't control Facebook, and yet Facebook can have an impact on you. But collectively, the sum of the companies serve as a ballast against, a weight against each other, right? So there tends to be normative behavior between them. But more importantly, it's possible for you and your students to found new companies and new technology. And there's plenty of new technology coming and plenty of people to build it. And the revolution that's going to come in biology and medicine in terms of human health and so forth, I want to advance that. So I reject these arguments that everything's happening too fast. I'd like things to happen faster. In particular, I'd like to get the pandemic over so we can get back to being global, as opposed to what I view as a retrenchment of the values and views that I've had for 40 years around globalization.
I mean, I see that. I also like the technology to move fast, but perhaps the public debate has to speed up in order to keep up with the changes. Yes.
Yeah.
The other aspect I would like to highlight a little bit is, what's your take on the trust in science? Do you see with the COVID crisis, people trust more in science, or is actually less trust and more trust in conspiracy theory? How do you see the pendulum swinging back and forth on that?
What I don't understand is that this is a public health crisis where people are dying and getting sick, and older people are worse, but young people get it, and there are cases of people being very seriously injured. And yet there are these people who are spreading clearly factually incorrect information, and they're being spread by person to person. And they go, oh, look. And so I go look at the underlying source data and I say, this is just crap. Right? It's not true. So no, the hospitals aren't full. Well, here's an article that says the hospitals here are full. Now, do you think that the article is wrong? Are you being lied to by the mainstream press? Go visit the hospital yourself to see if you can get an admission for something other than being in COVID. And you'll discover, by the way, the hospital is full because the hospital people are not lying. So what I don't understand is, in a time, I mean, I don't mind the normal political dialogue and the sort of shaping information, but when it involves people's lives and Americans, we're better than this, right? We're better than this, and we should be calling out the people who are deliberately misinforming things. So let's just review, right? These are the tools you have as a citizen: mask wearing, social distancing, right? And be outside. By the way, you had exactly the same tools in 1918.
Yes. So we need some more advancement on that front too.
Right. But and going back to the trust in science, last time I checked, science governed everything that I was doing. And I have yet to find any non-scientific explanations for the science that is physics and math and so forth and so on. And somehow this reaction that scientists are wrong, it's used as an excuse to make people feel good about themselves or something. But science, I'm obviously a scientist, and science is how we make progress as a human society. It's how medicine gets better. It's how we responsibly develop the world. It's how we develop energy sources that are better. It's how we learn, et cetera, et cetera. I can go on and on about it. This anti-science bias indicates to me that the people either don't understand how science works or don't want to believe that a fact which they hold to themselves is in fact not true. And what I recommend to people is when you hear claims, including mine, right, go check them out, but do your research. And if you do your research, I think you're going to find that science, it's still the case that the sun comes up every morning and it goes down in the evening for all the orbital mechanics that, that we've known since Galileo.
But do you have the sense that the anti-science bias became worse with social media, or it's actually, you know, with the COVID crisis, I even have the sense that science came back. So experts have more influence than they had before the COVID crisis, or would you disagree with that? Did the COVID crisis help to bring experts back into the limelight and back into business?
Maybe, but the coordinated destruction of the reputations of scientists across fields and for deliberate business or political reasons is really not a good thing, right? And I've seen plenty of this.
So perhaps let's move on a little bit to algorithms and artificial intelligence. So the way I see algorithms, you know, you can outsource your decision making to some algorithm or artificial intelligence. They'll make the choices for you. And one simple example would be the GPS is just an algorithm in a sense, where instead of deciding going left or right, the GPS gives you essentially the information and then you just follow it. Do you see two dangers there, that the algorithms is, on the one hand, it's a black box. You don't really know what's going on, but people unlearn the decision making. So we might just follow some algorithms provided by some big companies and we're not able anymore to drive on our own because we're just following blindly the GPS. And so we don't become less citizens who think on their own. And the other thing is, if something is guided by some algorithm, do you still have the choice to run away from it or choose your own? So that the Albert Hirschman spirit, that you can exit from something, run away from it, and that creates this competitive pressure. Do you think there are a lot of competing, you know, algorithms out there where you can switch from one to the next, or is it one big algorithm controlling that? So how do you see that dimension?
So I want to distinguish between algorithms and AI. So the traditional algorithms are decision algorithms, and they produce an outcome. So GPS gives you an answer. It doesn't give you a range. It says, you know, this is the answer. And so we have all adapted to the presence of algorithms in that form. The thermostat in your home, the computers that you're using now. No one has too much anxiety over the fact that the computer is busy taking the bits from the camera, sending it over the internet, over Chinese equipment, by the way, to get to you and me, and then we're sharing it among our colleagues and friends. I think we've adapted to that. AI algorithms, which are new, have an imprecision in them, and they're not yet suitable for life-critical activities. And so the easy example that I would use is if you're using a self-driving car, you would like the self-driving car to have learned before you got in it. And so there are many, many consequences of learning algorithms that are different from the deciding algorithms that the GPS examples. So in the case of looking at the future, today we coexist with these static algorithms fairly well. They're well understood. Again, you know, the MPEG algorithm that compresses our video and so forth, it works well enough. But in the future, so we'll base ourselves on those. In the future, you're going to see more and more hybrid models where the person and the computer are learning together. Partly because the human learns in a way that's different from the computer, partly because the computer won't always make it a perfect analysis. And so you'll see in the financial areas and regulations and so forth and so on, you'll see them use AI algorithms, but you'll also have human checks. And I think that's the most likely scenario. There are many, many people who speculated of what happens when AI is as smart and reliable as human beings. But it turns out that being as smart and reliable as human beings is quite difficult. And that technology is not yet upon us, although it may be in the future, but not soon.
I see. So, but are you worried that, so the old type of algorithms, you know, you can go line by line and you understand what's going on. The new algorithms, it's more black boxy because you just, you know, the algorithm learns on its own. do you really think there should be some transparency about the underlying algorithm, or do you think it's not possible anyway because it's inherently intransparent? It should be some rating agencies saying this is a good one, that's a bad one. How should people decide which algorithm to look for?
These are all legitimate questions, but I think it's too soon. There is a great deal of research, some of which I'm funding, which is in trying to understand what's really going on inside these algorithms. We don't today understand exactly how the algorithms work mathematically, and in particular, we don't understand their failure modes. We can't say based on this condition, et cetera. There are very serious attempts at getting the machine learning models to be able to explain what they know in a way that is then inspectable. So this may get resolved, or it may remain a problem. There are many other issues. For example, the computation requirements for these algorithms is massive, right? So there are limits to that, and so they're expensive. There are questions about interference in the models. Could an opponent or an actor go in and change your model in a way that you wouldn't notice it, and then make it less valuable, et cetera, et cetera?
Yeah, that's actually quite a nice segue to the next topic, where we talk about cybersecurity. And I refer to this report you mentioned earlier, this bipartisan report. Can you a little bit allude to it? You know, what is the US approach and the China approach to artificial intelligence? And where do you see the cooperation between government, universities, and private firms? That's one of the aspects which you highlight very much as being important. Yeah. Is this as good as it is already, or should there's a huge way to improve things in the US?
So I am the chairman of a congressional commission on artificial intelligence and national security. And we have looked very thoroughly and carefully at the state of the research enterprise and the question of China versus America. And the consensus is that the top researchers and top activity is still in the United States and in the West. However, the Chinese are catching up very, very quickly. And if you go to the NSCAI website, you'll find the metrics and the numbers. But it's quite sobering. Chinese have made AI a core priority of their development between now and 2030. They've announced publicly as part of their strategy that they want to dominate the field by 2030. That has all sorts of implications for us. With respect to cyber, China and Russia engage in cyber attacks. We know there are other countries that are rumored to do it as well. In general, my view on cyber attacks is that cyber attacks occur because the systems have not been made strong enough to defend against it. So a reasonable expectation is that the internet was optional and now it's mandatory. And that one of the mandatory requirements is that if you're on the internet, you have to be at the state of the art of security and so forth, in the same sense that you wouldn't want to get a virus and give it to someone else in the pandemic. The same thing is true. With respect to how the US government should work, our commission is in the process of recommending an increase in research funding in AI and a large increase in training. Turns out the federal government has many, many training programs which are not particularly focused on computer science and AI and technical skills of this kind, and we're working hard to get them. We also point out that in America, the innovation is largely occurring in private firms, not in government research labs. So it's either in university research labs or private firms. So it's very important that the government collaborate with them to sort of move it forward.
So where do you see other parts of the world like Europe or India? I mean, there's a lot of intelligence in India as well. Is there anything, are they collaborating with the US, or where do you see you only see US and China essentially, or is this?
Well, we use China and the West as a metaphor.
The West, okay.
And the West is essentially the United States. There's a few places in Europe which have strong AI programs, and Israel as well. There is some activity in Japan, and there's some activity in India. It's reasonable to expect that India should become a powerhouse in this area because of the extraordinary quality of the Indian universities, the ITTs.
So do you think like a few universities would make a huge difference, like 10 IITs can change a whole country's perspective? So how many researchers do you need in order to have a great AI cyber strategy?
Well, we don't give a particular number, but the American model has worked well. You know, the way our university system works, the number of researchers, AI researchers are being, you know, given assistant professorships very quickly. It's the hottest field right now, hard to hire into. So I think the market is dealing with this one correctly.
Very good. So let me go to innovation more generally. We talked a lot about innovation, but one striking feature, if you look at the internet and IT technology, that the economic model has changed of innovation. While in the 1990s or early 2000s, it was essentially for a company to have a startup and go to an IPO later on. Now we moved much more what I call this pharmaceutical model, where you create a startup and then one of the big companies will take it over. So it's much more a takeover away model compared to what it was in the 1990s when Google, Amazon, and the current giants essentially did IPOs. And you might argue that's actually a good thing because you need a certain way of standard setting, and having some big platforms gives you some standards and everybody is converging to these standards, and that makes the whole product space more homogeneous and more interoperable. So interoperability is actually much better, but it also gives these platforms monopoly power. How do you see the shift? Do you agree with the shift of the model of innovation, how to finance innovation in the US? Do you think it's a good thing or is it a bad thing, or how in balance, how do you see that?
Again, it's worth studying other technology booms. Between 1910 and 1935, 1940, there were hundreds and hundreds of automobile companies centered in Detroit, all of which were ultimately merged, went out of business and so forth. In fact, General Motors is a holding company of such firms. So we forget that 70 years ago, we went through a similar process of greenfield, huge creativity, many different approaches, and then a standardization into what turned out to now, I think, roughly be 2 or 3 firms. And I think that logic for mature technology is true in many other industries when you study them. They start off with this enormous amount of creativity. To me, the question is that going to happen with tech? And I don't think we know. The venture capitalists I know have a way in which they speak to each other, which goes something like this. There are no big platform category killer spaces left. The big companies are occupying all of them. The most recent ones, which involve companies like Uber, well, they weren't such a good idea anyway because of two-sided markets, and there's no good place to put your money. Well, of course, people said this 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 40 years ago, and I'm sure it's wrong. I'm sure what is true is that the age of intelligence, as I call it, which is an age where new ways of doing business and activity and so forth, and generally AI applied to everything, will create opportunities for very large companies that are completely different from the ones we have today. It's always been true. Why would we think it isn't true now? These tools are far too powerful to be static. This is not like the combustion engine, which has improved by 1% a year. These are still moving very quickly.
So if you were to compare it, you would compare it with the introduction of electricity, or historically, and which time frame would you say for electricity? Would it be 1920s or?
Well, in electricity, of course, there was a big fight between AC and DC, but then it was heavily regulated, and then it became essentially a public utility. So I don't think that's a fair comparison. The reason I like the car company example is that if you look at it during that period, which was, by the way, 40 or 50 years, you had tremendous innovation, new kinds of braking systems, new kind of control systems, new kind of safety systems, all around a basic concept of propulsion. And I think we'll see similar things here.
So one part of innovation is the health industry. And I know that Google tried to get into it and then decided not to be so involved. Perhaps, do you think the COVID crisis is actually a big game changer in this sense, that all of lot of regulatory hurdles will be removed. Some telemedicine regulatory hurdles are suddenly gone and many other aspects are gone. Do you think that will be a big boost for the health industry to move much more in the IT space, and perhaps some big tech companies can come into that? The other thing, of course, privacy is a big issue in this space as well. But there's a privacy about my own data, and there's a privacy about the correlation across data. And to what extent should the correlation across data, which is really where the health information is, be protected by privacy? And so I just would like to get your perspective on the health industry, particularly in the light of the COVID crisis.
I'm skeptical that much will change in the health industry because it's so large and it has so many different and uncorrelated regulatory points. I'm working on a New York State commission, which includes looking at telehealth. And we're working very hard to try to get telehealth to be an equal of traditional health. And one of the simple principles about health is that if you change the reimbursement systems, that seems to change behavior in the medical profession. But the complex of regulations, which include privacy, the self-interest of the public, the private firms that run health, the fact that data is not broadly shared even for research purposes, indicates to me that the kind of explosion of data and information and so forth that we have seen in other areas will be much slower in health. And I think it should be faster. And I'll give you the simple argument. Let's imagine that there were a rule that healthcare data could be shared for research purposes without identifying information. Okay, and let's assume we could do that. Then using AI, we would be able to see correlations of disease that we don't see today. And that you could build a tool, for example, that would, when you came into the hospital, it would say, here's Eric, but Eric is similar in this way to 500 people who had this outcome. Let me warn the doctor to check for this. We don't have such a system because we don't allow the data sharing for research purposes. And the HIPAA laws do allow that, right? But for some complicated reasons, it's not occurring.
Do you see other countries leapfrogging essentially who have less regulatory hurdles? Or is there certain countries where they're plowing ahead and then they go, wow, we have to follow up on that? Or do you think the US will be the leading nation in the health dimension?
So in Europe, you have a number of countries that have nationalized systems which have common data. So many people think that the universities and research projects in those countries, because they have common data, will be able to do it. When you actually dig into it, you discover that although they have one system, they don't have common data. So there's a problem there. There are many people who think that in China, because it's essentially unregulated, and I know of a number of startups which are trying to aggregate this data to do it, but there are all sorts of other problems, which is holding them back. So I think the conclusion is we don't know about the health industry and the use of IT. I would tell you that we should accelerate health industry's adoption of IT, not for financial reasons, although it benefits that, but for safety and health reasons. We will be healthier if more data is known about people who have a similar condition. So if I have a condition, I really am more interested in getting my condition treated than the privacy around anyone else knowing that I have it. It's in my interest to live.
And you don't see, so if I were to ask you for, when will the big breakthroughs come? You don't see them in the next decade because of these bureaucratic problems?
It's very hard to know when they're going to come. If you look at AI today in medicine, there are tremendous results around essentially supplementing the radiologist, supplementing the cancer doctor, much, much better examples, but they're not operating at scale yet. And so my question is, we know the science works, we know the AI works, we know it works in healthcare, but we have not collectively adopted it quickly enough.
Can I interject another question concerning virtual reality?
Sure.
Do you think with the COVID crisis, of course, there is a huge boost and accelerated speed to transition to a virtual reality. How do you see that? Do you think that people will lose touch with the real reality by going too much in virtual reality and live, essentially a second life or most of their life in the virtual reality? Do you see any dangers there, or how have you thought about these aspects?
I have. The country to study there is South Korea. In South Korea, the gaming culture is so strong, and the the internet is 200 megabits is the base internet and so forth. They're so connected that they are beginning to have problems of people who have lost touch with real reality because they live so much in their digital reality. So this is a concern. When you talk about virtual reality, you're probably talking about the goggles and so forth. I prefer to talk about this as the information space. So when I wake up in the morning, the first thing I do is I participate in the information space. And before I go to sleep, the first thing I do is turn off my phone, because that's how I participate in my information space. That's how 99% of humans operate now. I don't think we evolved to live in this dynamic information space all the time. And I think it has all sorts of secondary effects. But nevertheless, this is what's going to happen. And we need to think about how powerful this information space is and how it will change human consciousness. So an example would be that if everything that I see, I believe is misinformation, then how do I trust things? How do I make a decision? Where are my beliefs? And it's going to get even more interesting when we have AI assistance. So it's reasonable to expect the next 10 or 20 years that you will have an AI assistant which is highly personalized to you with your permission, bought in and so forth, which understands exactly who you are and what you do. It helps you teach, it helps you prepare, it helps you do your research, it helps you make choices. What do I have for dinner tonight? Those assistants will have a great deal of power over your information space. And in particular, you'll probably use them to deal with all of the information that's being generated. What do you believe? That's going to be both an incredibly powerful tool, but also one that will be controversial because you'll have to make choices.
Interesting world, but do you also worry about getting all the stimuli all the time and then people cannot really sit back and think carefully, so they're constantly driven, and rather than, you know, thinking carefully, proving a theorem or something, I'm too much an academic.
So, no, lots of people are worried about this. The evidence is, there was this lengthy article a long time ago called Bowling Alone, where we would all end up being alone. And in fact, he was completely wrong. We're surrounded by all of our friends and activities and our virtual friends and our deep friends and our close friends and our non-friends and so forth and so on. I worry about something different. I worry about deep reading. I think we're certainly evolved to deal with fast decisions, you know, do this, do that, and so forth and so on. But the kind of brain development and thought development that comes from the kind of deep thinking that you're referring to, it can't be done while the television is on and the texts are coming in and social media is alive. It requires a focus, and it's going to be important that we find ways to preserve that.
So one aspect I would like, coming from an economics angle, is also talking about money, and especially about payment systems. Of course, there's a big change. You know, Facebook was pushing for Libra, and it did essentially on its own. But now, you know, Libra is not at the forefront anymore. It's not paying with WhatsApp. That's, you know, in India, 400 million people use WhatsApp. In Mexico, a huge majority use it. Brazil just shut it down in a sense that they can't pay with WhatsApp. But essentially, the payment system is changing radically in many, many countries. I know that Google went a different route. Google partnered with a big bank to do it together. Do you think, what's your take on, you know, doing the tech companies on their own, or should tech companies go together with traditional banks to do it? Or do you think the payment system should be primarily run by the public sector, by central banks? Do you have any thoughts on that?
I think the first question is, are we going to have central banks in the future? And the answer is yes. It's not maybe. Yes. And the reason we're going to have central banks is because of the Depression. Right, that we understand that the markets can get out of whack and that the central bank has to respond. And so people who think that somehow there's going to be a new Bitcoin-based world where there's no government control at all, that's a fine vision, but I think the facts don't support it. So given that, I'm a believer that the regulator should allow as much experimentation as possible, because the current systems are not competitive with what China has. And we might as well move forward as quickly as we can. In China, basically, they've unified the notion of your phone, your ID, your payment system, and your presence. And so you can essentially do everything with your phone, right? It's essentially money, it's essentially access, it's buying things. It's incredibly easy. I had one friend who had told me he had not used cash for 2 years while in China. That literally he just doesn't carry it, doesn't have to think about it. And there are many benefits to that, including the ability to detect corruption, misuse of anonymous money and that kind of stuff. But I think my general answer is we want as many experiments as we can to make this happen. We are behind what China is doing.
And you would like the central banks to essentially allow sandboxes in regulation where, or you want different countries experimenting in different directions, or within a country?
Yes. One of the principles about experimentation is that governments tend to believe that they know the answer, and so they write the rule precisely to cover everybody. But in fact, you can't invent anything new if the thing that you knew is not allowed by regulation. So you need places for experimentation. So I'm assuming that that WhatsApp will eventually look like WeChat with respect to the way it invokes apps and pays for money, because WeChat was in an unregulated space and the rest of us were subject to regulations. So there's a case where WeChat is teaching us something.
But in China, it's also the government or the Central Bank of China now injecting digital money as well. So you would like to have competition from the government side as well, or that will,
okay. And we're going to find these models, but we're going to have central banks. But the job of the central bank is to keep the economy growing and keep the currency roughly stable.
Let me just interject one more thing, because I care a lot about that. There are different ways to have money. One is where you just execute essentially the payments, but the unit of account, what type of currency you use, dollar or renminbi, is still more or less handled by the government or the central bank. The other thing is more the Libra, the original Libra plan, which are not stable coins, where it's a separate currency with its own exchange rate with other currencies. So that's quite a radical difference between the two models. You would say you would also experiment with the latter one as well, or?
I would. I'm skeptical that separate currencies can operate without some form of central bank behind them. But you're more of an expert at this than I, so I'll defer to your judgment on this.
All right, thanks. So let's move to the next aspect, and that is more about regulation and taxation. So again, coming from the government side. So we touched upon already that you have these big platforms, and they have quite naturally some monopoly power, which is, they also have some standard setting power, which might make sense for interoperability reasons. The question for me is a little bit, how would you coordinate the international tax law in a virtual world? So we have a tax law which is very, very outdated. It's very, where's the physical plant? And it was very useful 50 years ago because there was a plant, you could tax this plant. Now, once you move into the virtual space, you can move around your virtual space wherever you want and to the lowest tax haven you want to prefer. Do you see, should we have a radical overhaul of the international tax law, how we tax corporations? Because it's also a question about fairness and support for a free market economy that might undermine the free market economy to some extent.
So I started working on this when I was at Sun in the early 90s. And at the time, Ireland had put in a new tax rate that was lower than everyone else's. So I went to Ireland and we set up our subsidiary there. And the fact that the European Union went to a single monetary standard but had differential tax rates always confused me. Mm. And in America, you have the same thing in that companies can locate in, say, South Carolina because there's a tax break. So you have to find some way to balance the local interests of one of the players versus the security of the system. Over the years in Google and dealing with people with this, our overall tax rate was quite a healthy number, quite a high number. And the places where we paid more than the average never complained. And the places that we paid less than the average complained bitterly. So what I concluded about taxes is that there needs to be an international regulatory body. They need to come to a compromise on these issues. and people need to follow it. There is a redo of the international tax rules underway right now, and I'm sure it will be unpopular. But at the end of the day, you're always going to have this problem when you have different ways in which you can operate in the countries. I don't see another solution.
And do you see in the future, essentially, you alluded to it, that Europe will be one, are there more digital borders in a sense that, you have common privacy regulation, you have common digital regulation essentially. So the digital borders become much more important than the physical borders?
Well, Europe is trying to create a digital services platform and try to get the 28 countries into a common digital standard. The way Europe operates, if I can be blunt here, is so regulatory in nature that it tends to write the rules so precisely that I worry that in order to put the rules in, it also freezes the status. So one of the problems that you have with regulations in this space is that you can over-regulate because of the perception of current problems when in fact the technology is going to move forward. So I am generally in favor of a more flexible regulatory approach and state the goals. And the goal for Europe should be to have a large number of highly successful global technology platforms, which Europe does not today have. And Europe should do everything it can to be a global competitor against America and the Chinese, because I think that would benefit everyone.
Thanks a lot, Eric. Can I just conclude with one final question? Let's suppose I'm from Germany, as you probably know.
Yes, of course.
If the former Stasi in East Germany had the current technologies we have now, would you think that the East Germany would have fallen, the Berlin Wall would have come down, or do you think they would have been way better in surveillance?
You've asked exactly the right question. And so let's use China. So let's look at the Stasi versus China. As you know, the Stasi collected files on everybody, followed them around, all of that stuff was collected. But at the end of the day, the East German miracle did not happen and the West German miracle did happen, and you understand the difference. Yes. And so that ultimate dialogue, that ultimate disparity drove it. The same thing is not occurring between North Korea and South Korea for reasons that I don't fully understand. I've been to both. And in China, you don't have that comparison. So you just have the surveillance and the control. So I think a lot of it depends on the question of, are things getting better? And people are very sensitive to how they're doing relative to others. So it seems to me that if you were the Stasi now, which of course you and I would never be, you would be acutely focused on making the situation better so that you would remain in power.
That's a good closing. So typically in this webinar series, you have one last sentence or to make a positive statement. We talked about a lot of positive developments. If you have one last thought about what comes positive out of the COVID crisis, do you have any quick thought on that?
I think one of the most interesting things that has come out of the COVID crisis is that it has become okay to work from home and be productive. And this turns out to benefit women who have a disproportionate amount of child rearing, and they felt under great pressure to be at the office all the time. So one positive, in a terrible, terrible thing, but one potential positive is that the workforce will become just a little bit more flexible for people, women and men, who are unable or unwilling to go to the office in the way that I did for so many years. And that's a good example. There are probably many others.
Thanks a lot, Eric. And thanks for all your support, also for Princeton University for being such a great alumni. And I hope to see you soon again, perhaps in real life, not only over virtual.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.